Such an interesting topic. And from my perspective, with a HR background, I have worked with individuals who have been through processes, I think, in the organisation, and have also, in a way, perhaps contributed to creating an ongoing stressor because of what you just mentioned, in that there are systems and structures and processes that organizations, I guess, have to traverse, for want of a better word, in how they manage their employee relations, if I can call it that. And so from my perspective, there's been this real push around managing risk and managing to make sure that the organization's interests are somewhat protected. And whilst there is a place for that and a role for that, it kind of doesn't to bring itself to that individual need, and it doesn't take into consideration those needs of those particular individuals. And so, as I said, I've seen lots of experiences where the structures and the processes and the relationships within organizations have created various types of trauma for people. And I was really interested in your point before about how do we define trauma and what does workplace trauma look like. For me, it's an individual piece. We are all different in terms of our needs and our values and our personalities. And so what I might consider to be trauma is something that you might not necessarily consider to be very traumatic at all. So I think if we were to look at the definition of workplace trauma, it's got to be something that is really quite broad and involves individual perspectives, motivations, values, because, yeah, we're all different. And we all respond differently to behaviours and to those organisational structures. The other thing that I was going to say, and the thing that I find quite interesting about all of this is, and you and I talk about this often, is this masculine energy that we find in our workplaces. And it creates environments where there's competition and there's power and there's this need to control, I guess, in a sense, what happens, when it happens, how it happens, which does not necessarily bring about cohesive working relationships. And the piece for me around that is, when we're engaged in those types of structures, we forget about those needs for the more feminine qualities like compassion and empathy and understanding, and we position ourselves more in that masculine space than we do in the feminine space, because that feminine value, if you like, of compassion and empathy is seen as weakness in the organization and not acceptable. And so my own experiences in that is that I didn't feel comfortable at all in expressing that level of vulnerability or that level of compassion or that heart-centered response that we have to impacts and the way that we conduct ourselves in the workplace, and those values of, if that's a high value set for you, then trying to conduct yourself in another way is really quite challenging. And my own experiences with that is that I operated in that very masculine space, very controlled, very structured, very process driven, process oriented, very directive, if you like. And I had this particular view around what success and what achievement was. And for me, success and achievement was climbing that ladder and being perfect at everything that I did, and never allowing myself to be seen as weak, or to be seen as, like I had to be very clear about where I was going and what I was doing. Because if I deviated from that for a second, there was that element of me, and from my own perspective, being seen as weak. And if you're in those environments where you have to manage those difficult situations, the last thing that I felt I could be was to be seen as weak. And so I created this persona, and the persona was that people saw me as being scary and being quite direct, and not necessarily confrontational, but just you go and you disregard anything outside of the needing to achieve a particular goal or a direction. Like that was it. I had tasks to do, I had goals to complete, and that's how I focused, and that's how I survived in that particular environment. And then for me, I had operated like that. I would have thought for maybe 10, 15 years. And I had some health issues 2 to 3 years ago. And I started to not be able to regulate an emotional response. One of my key characteristics of a successful day was to never let anyone see me cry. That just wasn't acceptable to me, wasn't acceptable. And there were times in those last probably 3 years where I cried almost every day. And so I started to feel that I wasn't doing a good job, that I wasn't good at what I was doing, that I could no longer lead a team and be productive. And I really felt this myself go into this, it was almost like a tailspin. And the more that I tried to control myself in the workplace and continue to push through, the more that I found myself getting more and more anxious and more unsettled within myself. And those tasks and those activities that I could do, no problems, go into a room, engage in termination, change and redundancy discussions, it didn't feel right anymore. And I started to have this question about values versus organizational responsibilities. And that alignment piece for me became something that I had never questioned before or never thought about before. And it was a really interesting experience for me to start to question where I was, what I was doing, and where I was going. And if I, as a leader of the team, was having those doubts about values and what I was being or what I thought I was being asked to do and what was naturally aligning to me weren't compatible, then where did that leave me? As a person who had always been a high performer, had always done as she was asked to do, had protected the interests of the organization, and that was my number one goal for me. And so as it all started to, I started to question a lot of these bits and pieces. And the more I started to question, the sicker I got and the more unwell I got, which ultimately resulted with me having to make a decision. And that decision was whether I was going to continue to push myself through, or whether I was going to make a decision to exit and leave. And I think you and I have talked about this before. I wrestled with that decision for 2 years maybe, and the more anxious I got, the more unwell I got, the more I had to drag myself to work every morning, the more I started to doubt. Again, the doubts came in, and I wasn't good enough. And how could I be leading a team of people if I could barely get myself out of bed? And this just continued in a spiral until I made the decision that I didn't have any other option but to put my health first and put my well-being first. And as difficult of a decision as it was to leave, it was the right decision for me. And so that decision was made almost 15 months ago now. And the last 15 months have been a journey for me around acknowledging and processing through my thoughts around trauma for me, and what that looked like for me, and what has really helped me in that journey is being able to step away from that journey. And I couldn't, now in hindsight, for me, and Patricia, I did everything. I reset my boundaries. I started work at a responsible hour. I finished at a responsible hour. I set reminders in the diary. I, for the first time ever, started to take a lunch break and do all of those tiny things, which I thought would help. And they did to a certain extent. But what I really needed to do was to pull back and start to have a look at and a reassessment of who I was as a person, and what drives me, not outside of the organization, outside of the need to be successful and to achieve whatever that looks like, whatever success and achievement is defined as. I needed to step away and look at what that was, and I needed to reconcile with the fact that I had been contributing to my own trauma, and I had been almost feeding it in a way. And it was only maybe 2 to 3 months ago when I started to look at this concept, and I'd heard of burnout before and I'd heard people speak about it. And I started to dig a little deeper into what that was. And when I looked at what that was and how it was defined, the exhaustion that I felt, that inability to get myself out of bed of a morning, never realizing that that was the start of the burnout symptom. And so I continued to push through because that's what we do. And then when I realized that cynicism that I had towards organizations in general, And the way that I viewed organizations had been a component of me just absolutely hitting the wall. And then that thought for me around, well, I'm not performing anymore, I'm not good enough, that shame and that guilt of potentially letting people down, was when I went, oh, that's what happened to me. That's exactly how I felt. And it was only by making the choice to step away from that was I able to see what it was. And had I not stepped out of that and made that choice, I don't know that I would have been able to acknowledge or admit that I was like a significant number of people who had just hit the wall, in a sense. So I don't know that actually answered the question that you asked me, but I kind of like went on a tangent there. But that to me is workplace, and my situation is a little bit different, and I can now sit back and reflect on workplace trauma, both from the perspective of an employee or an individual, knowing that the structures and the processes that are in place, and then from my own perspective, looking back and acknowledging my own contributions to where I found myself.
Yeah, and I feel like trauma is subjective, and it's not necessarily about the event so much, because I think in previous, I guess in common knowledge, I think people associate trauma to something that happens, like a war or a car accident or a but there can be so many different factors in environments that make us feel constrained in some way, or constrain us some way, teach us to constrain ourselves in some way, that we end up being under a force that's not healthy for us. Potentially, if it's something like violence or bullying, that's quite traumatic and sudden, that's trauma. It can be big T trauma and small t trauma, and the more sustained pieces that you're talking about, the I think you really spoke into the drive, right? Having to be productive at work, having to be action oriented, make decisions. So there was little space for the compassion and the caring. And sometimes I see that in organizations, because they do have systems. It's easy to point to a procedure when you're time bound, rather than to have that compassionate discussion in some cases. And I think that is really, we've allowed this governance and decision making and the rules to dictate, and lost a little bit of our humanity. And that might be the drive between making money versus, creating.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right that that drive to create the dollars, and that drive to almost survive in an increasingly competitive market, has shifted the focus away from people and the people-centered approaches towards that real commercial side. That's my experience.
And what I know you said you suffered from burnout, so and you had mentioned in the beginning that you didn't actually know, you potentially didn't recognize what it was that was happening until you stepped away from it. So what are the things that led you up to the point where you actually just decided to leave?
Yeah, look, I had for me it was all about my mental health and maintaining or realigning or trying to get to a point where I understood what my value set was and who I was as a person and what my contribution needed to be, not just within an organizational context, but my contribution more broadly and more holistically. And for me, when I could no longer force myself to get out of bed, and when I could no longer get through the day without feeling physically unwell, like whether or not I would be staring at the computer screen for at least an hour, just doing nothing because my brain just could not compute, or when things that were really easy for me became really hard. That's when I knew that I had to make that decision. And as I said before, it wasn't an easy decision for me, and it had taken some time. But when I could no longer focus on what I was there to do, and when I felt like I was being more disruptive than I was contributing, and that they were all my perceptions, and that's how I was feeling, because I think for me I was really unwell, and it took me maybe 12 months to acknowledge that I was not coping. I didn't want to admit that I wasn't coping, and when all of that came into play, I made the decision. And the other decision for me that crystallized it in my mind was, I had been, just prior to my departure, working with a number of women, female leaders, I would like to call them, I will call them, who were in that same position that I didn't realize I was in, but was in. And I found myself having an alignment question with myself about how could I coach, guide, and ask those women to step outside of something if it didn't feel right for them, and if it made them unwell. Who was I to be asking them or challenging them or questioning them about their own sense of needing to stay in that when I wasn't prepared to do it myself? And so it came down to this decision around, well, if I'm not prepared to do it, I can't ask a member of my team, or I can't ask a member of the broader collective to do the same thing. And that was really the piece for me where I went, okay, it's time for me to move on. And what I would say to that, which I find really interesting on my own journey of, I call it healing and reconnecting, what I've discovered is all of those pieces that I was trying not to exhibit or show, that's actually who I am as the person. And so that disconnect for me between who I actually am and who I was wearing the mask to be, that's why it fell away, because I'm actually, in my heart space, the person I was trying not to be, if that makes sense. And so I think that contributed to my sense of what trauma was for me. To take out any piece around organizations and structures and those sorts of things, this was a journey for me around, well, what is my identity and who did I learn to be? And so the last little piece for me has been about unlearning who that is. And I find that a fascinating insight for myself after pulling back and stepping away from that and giving myself space and time to heal.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned like it's almost like an evolution, right? And you are in this environment, and there might be aspects of, in my own case, aspects that don't quite serve you, potentially leave you with an emptiness rather than a really fulfillment, really.
Yeah.
And the search for deeper purpose or the search for deeper meaning inevitably shifts you to this place of recognizing how much you've learned inside of the organization or from the community or society that you're in about life, and how those elements might not be true, exactly what you mentioned, might not be true for self.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was the most, and it's an ongoing process and it's an ongoing journey for me, that recognition and that acknowledgement that I had burnt myself out, and the unpacking of what had led to that and why that had happened, and how did I not know, and how did I not understand or acknowledge that's what was happening, is a really fascinating piece of insight for me.
Yeah, well, and I would love, if you, I think you have shared around pieces like that, being in that drive state, being in the and just changing. And actually, I think it would be really useful for everybody to just express maybe exactly what burnout is.
Yeah, the way I see it.
Yeah.
So for me, if I think about the burnout piece, there were three elements for me. And if I look at the textbook definition of what that is, I pretty much ticked all of those boxes. So the first, if I look back now and I think symptom of that, was the exhaustion. Just literally at the end of the week, not us at the end of the week spending the weekend literally on the couch, not being able to shift, not being able to move, and then feeling guilty that I had wasted my weekend was, if I look back on it now, probably the first piece for me. I started to get really issues with my thyroid and issues with my adrenals. And I remember having just because I couldn't get out of bed, I couldn't get off the couch, and realizing sometime into this that wasn't normal, and there was something not quite right. And I remember going to my naturopath and doing a test. And when we looked at my adrenals, I'd peaked in my adrenaline by 8 a.m. in the morning. Right. So for me, trying to then get through the day, I had no adrenaline or adrenals left to get me through the day. And it was that spike for me about having to get myself to work that exhausted me. And then I had nothing left. And I always thought, I always reflect back on that. And even then, I didn't make the connection between where I was going and what was coming. I just knew that I needed to, physically fix myself. And I remember towards the end, even and I say the end like I was, shipping off to somewhere, but towards the end of when I'd made my decision, I'd even dropped back to 4 days. And I dropped back to 4 days on the guise of, and I now know what it was, that I wanted to go and start my business, and I wanted to go off and do coaching and all of that. But it was just to allow me to rest, because all I did was sleep on that Friday and the Saturday and the Sunday. But it was just my way of justifying why I wasn't able to function 5 days a week, let alone the weekend. So that was the first sign for me. And then the second sign for me, now that I reflect back on that, was just that questioning of everything. Like if there was an organizational decision, it would be questioned, and I would challenge it, and I would internally, not vocally, but internally, and just become really cynical about the world of work and things that were happening around in terms of work and all of that. I just became quite negative and cynical. So that, to me, which is, and I've, let's be honest, I've always had that tendency, but this was getting extreme. So that not that I realized it at the time, but that to me was the second piece for me. And then the third piece for me was that final piece about my own performance, and the fact that I didn't feel like I was contributing. I didn't feel like I added value. The things that I felt I was really good at, I started to question whether or not I was good at those things. And I had this view that I was going to jump rather than be pushed out, because my performance was really bad. And when I spent hours, and I just mentioned this, I spent hours just looking at the screen, not contributing, just looking at the screen, trying to think and process what was to come next. Like, what did I literally have to do next? I couldn't think what came next. And so I would just sit there, and I would close my door, and I would pretend I was doing something, but all I was trying to do was focus on, what do I do next? And for somebody who had always been the high performer, the high achiever, the one that pushed through, who could do multiple things in a day, and I couldn't do one thing in a day anymore, that was the piece for me where I really started to panic, and I started to get really anxious, and that just continued. And it, I would go to work and I would be physically sick, and I would shake, and I couldn't control my shaking, which was quite traumatic in a way, that I couldn't control my body. And so I would lock myself in my room, or in my office, I should say, trying to get control back. And so while I was internally struggling, I couldn't do what I was meant to be doing. And so for me, not that I put all of those pieces together, but that was the sequence for me. It was the exhaustion, the adrenal fatigue, the shaking, the just not being able to function. It was the cynicism, and then it was, I am not performing, I have to go. But I wasn't rationalizing that. What I was rationalizing was, oh, I've got this other new shiny little thing over here to do that I think I like doing. It makes me happy. I'm going to go off and I'm going to do that. And how can I ask others to do what I'm not prepared to do? So I had almost disassociated from my own trauma in a way, because I was trying to help others, not necessarily understanding my own. Yeah. So that to me is my journey. And it's taken me, as I said, for 15 months to come back into my own body and to be really clear now about what's happening in my body. And when I finished, I think for probably the first 3 weeks, all I did was sleep. That's all I did. That's all I did. Which then again added to that shame and added to that guilt around, well, why are you sleeping? Like, get up and do something, be productive. But what I realized was the blessing was in the rest, and I needed to rest before I was able to come back into that space of contribution.
That's amazing. Well, yeah, I mean that's a beautiful, detailed kind of journey. I think a lot of people are gonna grab from that elements of, because when you were talking, I was like, yes, yes. And so in the last couple of months, what are some pieces that have kind of really helped you, and what have you been realizing about how you want to move forward and contribute?
Yeah, I've been that's been something I've been reflecting on quite a bit, and trying to make some determinations about what I want to do next with the skills that I've acquired over, what is it now, 20 years of a corporate life. And where do I want to use those skills to add that contribution and to be of service? For me, that's really important, that piece I know. The rest I'm still working through. I do, though, have such a strong sense now of the connection of mind, body, soul. And every day is a practice of some type of reconnection back into myself, whether that's movement or meditation or that ability to sit still and quiet and not shift is something that I've been really working on in the last 2-3 months. And also the recognition that I burnt myself out and that I'm actually not alone in that. There are so many more people out there who have done exactly the same and gone through exactly the same pieces.
Yeah.
Which is really quite comforting to know, because as I was going through this, I would often think that I was alone and I wouldn't ask for help, and I wouldn't admit that there was something wrong. And if I look at the research on that burnout piece, it's very similar. It's a very similar story, and it's a very similar story around that need to downshift.
Yeah. And I think that's, that's when I personally started talking about this topic of the trauma in the workplace, and maybe shifting our understanding of, kind of calling out what it is, trauma, and the need to, maybe that it can be varying for many people. It is a subjective piece and fundamentally touches like the core of who it is that we are, our value and our self-worth.
And I think, Patricia, that's the piece I missed in the whole journey of my career, is that we are all different and we all view what happens to us in our life and in our workplaces differently. And what I now have learned is that what I thought was acceptable And those expectations that I put on myself and others were completely inaccurate, because everyone responds and reacts to things differently. And just because I had a persona, it didn't mean other people had to or should have had to operate in the same way. There were pieces in there for me around not acknowledging, not all the time, but sometimes, the difficulties that people were experiencing.
Yeah. I mean, there's it sounds like you're referring to, the growth of each one of us as individuals, and in our own psychology, the needing to encountering challenge in order for us to kind of grow. Sometimes I think about it like that. And certainly some challenges are more difficult than others, but it's a whole process. So I think you, in the same way that we might do this around our family in order to fit in, figure out how to constrain ourselves or how to act appropriately in order to fit in. We can do the same in organizations, because this is essentially what we're taught. And as you mentioned, it's a process of unlearning and kind of reconnecting, where you eventually get where your purpose is so much more important, where the company, your own values and the company values, the companies that you work with and their values become particularly important.
Yeah, it's all about that alignment piece. And it's all about the alignment piece for me, with the acknowledgement that everyone's circumstances are different. And for me, it's about an acknowledgement that everyone's situation and everyone's circumstance and the way that they view things and see things and experience things are completely different.
And as we do our work, we become more aligned, I think, and that much more integrated and that much more healthy. And it's great to have space in order to do that, because I think many people are in a system, in an organization, in that constraint where they have no other option, because it is about stability and financial security, and don't have that.
And that is the lesson that I've had to learn over the last 15 months, just how grateful I am that I have had the opportunity to be able to reflect and reconnect back into what is aligned with me. Because you are absolutely 100% correct. Not everybody is fortunate enough to be in that position.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I feel like the one thing that we can do here is, spread awareness and actually acknowledge, make it known that other people go through this, and actually acknowledge that we can have traumatic experience in a work environment. I think that's, from what I can see, that settles a lot of anxiety around for other people in attempting to make sense of what it is that they have experienced as well. So
we our stories are really important, and the need to share our stories is really important. So thank you, Patricia.
No problem.